royal guard stood frozen at his post outside Buckingham Palace, his usual stone-cold expression shattered by complete shock. His eyes went wide, his breath caught in his throat, and for the first time in his decorated military career, he broke protocol. What could possibly make a trained soldier, who had stood through storms, protests, and chaos, lose his composure? It was 5 simple words from 8-year-old Prince George that changed everything. Words so unexpected, so powerful, that they would make headlines around the world and force the palace to issue an emergency statement. What did the young prince say? The answer will leave you speechless. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Morrison took his position at the East Gate. At 32 years old, James had served in the Coldstream Guards for over a decade. He had completed 2 tours in Afghanistan, received commendations for bravery, and had been selected for the prestigious duty of guarding the royal family. His record was spotless, his discipline unquestionable. James stood perfectly still in his iconic red tunic and bearskin hat, his face an emotionless mask. Tourists gathered around him daily, trying to make him laugh, smile, or even blink. Children waved at him, adults took selfies, and occasionally someone would test his patience with rude gestures or loud noises. Through it all, James remained like a statue. It was a point of pride among the guards that nothing could break their concentration. The palace had been buzzing with activity all week. King Charles was hosting several diplomatic meetings, and security had been tightened across all entrances. The guard rotation had been adjusted, and everyone was on high alert. James had drawn the morning shift, which he preferred. The air was crisp, and the crowds were usually smaller before noon, around 10:30. James noticed movement near the palace's private entrance. His eyes, trained to catch every detail without moving his head, picked up 3 figures approaching. He recognized them immediately. It was Catherine, Princess of Wales, walking with her 2 oldest children, Prince George and Princess Charlotte. They were dressed casually, clearly returning from a private outing. George was wearing a navy blue jacket and jeans, looking every bit like a normal 8-year-old boy despite his royal status. Charlotte skipped alongside her mother, her ponytail bouncing with each step. Catherine carried shopping bags from what appeared to be a bookstore visit. The family often tried to maintain normal activities away from the public eye, though this was becoming increasingly difficult as the children grew older. James maintained his rigid posture as they approached. Royal protocol was clear. Guards were to acknowledge senior royals with the slightest nod of recognition, but were not to speak unless addressed directly or in cases of security concerns. James had encountered various members of the royal family dozens of times during his posting. The routine was always the same. A brief acknowledgement, a respectful distance maintained, and absolute professionalism. As they drew closer, James could hear Charlotte chattering excitedly about a book she had chosen. Catherine was listening with the patient smile that had endeared her to millions around the world. George, however, seemed quieter than usual. The young prince walked with his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. The family was about 20 feet away when something unexpected happened. George suddenly stopped walking. Catherine and Charlotte continued for a few steps before realizing he had fallen behind. Catherine turned back, concern flashing across her face. "George, what's wrong, darling?" she asked, walking back to her son. George didn't answer his mother. Instead, his eyes were fixed on James. The young prince stared at the guard with an intensity that was unusual for a child his age. James, following protocol, kept his gaze forward, not making direct eye contact, though he could see George clearly in his peripheral vision. "Mummy," George said softly. Still staring at James, "May I ask the guard something?" Catherine hesitated. She was always mindful of teaching her children to respect boundaries and protocol, even within their own home. The guards were working after all and had strict rules to follow. "Sweetheart, the guards are on duty. We shouldn't disturb them," Catherine replied gently. But George seemed unusually persistent. "Please, Mummy, it's important." There was something in her son's voice that made Catherine pause. In her years as a mother and a member of the royal family, She had learned to read her children's moods carefully. This wasn't a childish whim. George seemed genuinely troubled by something. "All right," she said carefully, "but be very quick and polite." George nodded and took several steps closer to James. The young prince was now standing directly in front of the guard, looking up at him. James could feel his heart rate increase slightly. This was unusual. While royal children occasionally played near the guards or waved at them, they rarely approached with such purpose. Charlotte had grown quiet now, too, sensing that something serious was happening. She clutched her new book and moved closer to her mother. Catherine watched carefully, ready to intervene if necessary. George took a deep breath. For a moment, James thought the boy might ask a typical child's question. Perhaps something about his uniform or his hat, or whether his feet hurt from standing so long. Guards had heard every imaginable question from curious children over the years. But what George said next was nothing like what James expected. The young prince's voice was clear and steady. Despite his young age, his eyes, so much like his mother's, looked directly up at James's face. And then George spoke 5 words that would change everything. "Do you want to die?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. James felt his entire body go rigid in a way that had nothing to do with military discipline. His eyes, which had been trained to remain fixed forward regardless of distraction, widened in complete shock. His breath caught in his throat. His mind, usually sharp and focused, went momentarily blank. Catherine gasped audibly. Her hand flew to her mouth. "George," she exclaimed, her voice sharp with a mix of shock and concern. Charlotte's eyes went round as saucers. Even at 6 years old, she could tell that her brother had said something terribly wrong, but George didn't look away from James. The boy's expression wasn't mischievous or cruel. Instead, he looked deeply concerned, almost frightened. Tears were beginning to form in the corners of his eyes. "I saw it," George continued, his voice now trembling. "I saw you. You were falling. There was so much noise and smoke. And you were alone?" James felt the color drain from his face. His professional composure, built over years of military training and dozens of dangerous situations, was crumbling. His hands, which should have remained perfectly still at his sides, began to shake slightly. Catherine quickly moved forward, placing her hands on George's shoulders. "George, what are you talking about? What did you see?" But George kept his focus on James. "You think about it every night, don't you? The tower. The explosion. Your friends who didn't come home?" The words hit James like physical blows. His mind flashed back to a dusty compound in Helmand Province 4 years earlier. The mission that had gone wrong. The improvised explosive device that had detonated just meters from his position. The faces of 3 fellow soldiers who had died that day. The survivor's guilt that haunted him every single night when he closed his eyes. Nobody knew about this. James had never spoken about it to anyone at the palace. His service record mentioned he had been in Afghanistan, but the details of that particular mission were classified. His therapist knew, of course, and his commanding officer, but certainly not an 8-year-old prince. James's breath was coming faster now. Sweat began to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He was having a panic attack, something that hadn't happened in over a year. The carefully constructed walls he had built around that traumatic memory were crashing down. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," George said, and now tears were streaming down his face. "But you have to know it wasn't your fault. And you're not supposed to leave yet. You have important things to do still." Catherine was now thoroughly alarmed. She had never seen her son like this. George had always been a sensitive, thoughtful child, but this was something else entirely. She pulled him back gently, wrapping her arms around him protectively. "James," Catherine said, and the use of his first name snapped him back to the present. She shouldn't have known his name. The guards wore no name tags when on ceremonial duty. But somehow she did. "Please, take a moment. Step aside." It was permission to break protocol, offered by someone with the authority to grant it. James took a stumbling step backward, then another. His carefully maintained posture collapsed. He reached out and steadied himself against the palace wall. Security personnel had noticed the commotion now. 2 additional guards were moving quickly toward them, along with a palisade who had been monitoring the cameras. The situation was rapidly escalating from a private moment into a full security incident. George was sobbing openly now, clutching his mother. "I didn't mean to scare him, Mummy. I just saw it. I saw what he was thinking. I saw how sad he is. I wanted him to know he matters." Charlotte, frightened by her brother's distress, began crying too. Catherine held both children close, her own face pale with confusion and concern. She looked at James, who was still leaning against the wall, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe normally. "Get him inside," Catherine told the approaching guards quietly but firmly. "Private room. And get his commanding officer. Now." One of the responding guards, a senior officer named Lieutenant Crawford, immediately moved to James's side. "Easy, Sergeant. Come with me." Crawford's voice was calm but concerned. He had served with James and knew something serious had happened. As Crawford guided James toward a side entrance, James looked back at George one last time. The young prince had his face buried in his mother's jacket now, but he turned slightly, and their eyes met. In that brief moment, James saw something in the child's eyes that defied explanation. It wasn't the look of a normal 8-year-old. It was older, wiser, and filled with a compassion that seemed impossible for someone so young. Then the door closed behind James, and he was led down a corridor he had walked 100 times before. But everything felt different now. The palace that had been his workplace, a place of routine and duty, suddenly felt strange and surreal. Behind him, in the courtyard, Catherine was speaking urgently into her mobile phone. The aide was already calling for the palace's private physician. Charlotte clung to her mother's hand, confused and frightened. And George stood quietly now, the tears still wet on his cheeks, staring at the door where the guard had disappeared. Something extraordinary had just occurred, something that would force everyone involved to question what they thought they knew about the world. The young prince had somehow reached across an impossible divide and touched a wounded soul. The question now was how, and more importantly, why? James found himself in a small, comfortable room somewhere in the private quarters of the palace. He had been here less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. His red tunic felt too tight, the bearskin hat now removed and placed carefully on a side table. Lieutenant Crawford had stayed with him, offering water and calm reassurance, but saying nothing about what had actually happened. They both knew the situation was far beyond normal protocol. The door opened, and a man in his 50s entered. He wore the insignia of a colonel and carried himself with the authority of someone who had commanded men in difficult situations. This was Colonel Andrew Fitzwilliam, the commanding officer of the Household Division. Behind him came Dr. Sarah Chen, the palace physician, carrying a medical bag. "Sergeant Morrison," Fitzwilliam said, his voice neutral but not unkind. "Lieutenant Crawford has briefed me on the basic situation. Before we discuss anything else, Dr. Chen needs to make sure you're physically all right." James nodded, still not trusting his voice. His hands had stopped shaking, but his mind was racing. What would happen now? Would he be removed from his post? Discharged? He had broken down in front of royalty. He had lost control. His career was likely over. Dr. Chen worked efficiently, checking his vital signs, asking him questions about his breathing, whether he felt dizzy or nauseous. James answered mechanically. His blood pressure was elevated, his pulse still too fast, but otherwise he appeared physically sound. "Going to recommend you take the rest of the day off duty," Dr. Chen said gently. "What you experienced appears to be an acute anxiety attack. Have you had these before?" James hesitated, then nodded. "After Afghanistan. But not for over a year. I've been managing it." "I see your medical records include some therapy sessions," Dr. Chen continued, glancing at a tablet she had brought. "Are you still in treatment?" "I was. I stopped about 6 months ago. I thought I was doing better." Colonel Fitzwilliam had been listening quietly. Now he spoke. "Sergeant, I need you to tell me exactly what happened out there. Everything the young prince said to you." James took a deep breath. This was it. He would have to relive the most surreal moment of his life and try to explain something he didn't understand himself. "Prince George approached me while I was on duty, sir. His mother gave him permission to speak to me. Then he asked me." James's voice faltered. He asked me if I wanted to die. Fitzwilliam's eyebrows rose sharply. What? That's what he said, sir. Do you want to die? And then he started talking about things he couldn't possibly know. About Afghanistan. About the mission in Helmand province 4 years ago. About the IED attack that killed 3 men from my unit. About how I think about it every night. The room fell silent. Dr. Chen exchanged a glance with Colonel Fitzwilliam. Crawford, who had heard none of this detail until now, stood with his mouth slightly open. How could he know those things? Fitzwilliam asked quietly. I have no idea, sir. That information is classified. It's not in my public service record. I've never discussed it with anyone here at the palace. I don't talk about it at all, except with my therapist. Could someone have told him? Perhaps overheard a conversation? James shook his head firmly. No, sir. The only person I've ever discussed the details with is Dr. Margaret Reynolds, my therapist at the Veterans Center in Hammersmith. Those sessions are completely confidential. And even if somehow that information leaked, why would anyone tell an 8-year-old child something so traumatic? Fitzwilliam began pacing. This is highly irregular. I'll need to speak with the Princess of Wales and get her account of what happened. In the meantime, Sergeant, you're relieved of duty for today. Get some rest. We'll determine next steps after I've had a chance to investigate this matter fully. As James was being escorted out through a back entrance to avoid the public and other guards, another drama was unfolding in Catherine's private sitting room. George sat on a sofa next to his mother, wrapped in a soft blanket despite the warm room. Charlotte had been taken to the playroom by her nanny, given some hot chocolate, and distracted with her favorite cartoons. But everyone knew this situation couldn't be distracted away. Prince William had been called back from a charity meeting in the city. He arrived within 30 minutes, his face etched with concern. Catherine had given him only the basic facts over the phone, but he could tell from her voice that something significant had occurred. George, William said, sitting down across from his son and taking the boy's small hands in his, your mother told me what happened with the guard. I'm not angry, but I need you to explain to me what you were thinking. George looked up at his father with red, swollen eyes. I didn't mean to cause trouble, Papa. No, you didn't, son. But you've said some very serious things to that man. Things that frightened him. Where did you hear about Afghanistan and explosions? I didn't hear it anywhere, George said quietly. I saw it. What do you mean you saw it? George struggled to find the words. Sometimes I see things. Pictures in my head. But they're not my pictures. They're other people's thoughts or memories. I don't know how to explain it better. William and Catherine exchanged alarmed glances. This wasn't typical childhood imagination. George spoke with too much certainty, too much detail. How long has this been happening? Catherine asked gently. George thought for a moment. I remember it starting maybe when I was 6. At first it was just little things. Like knowing when Charlotte was going to cry before she did. Or knowing that Granny was sad even when she was smiling. But lately it's gotten stronger. I see more things. Sometimes I see things that already happened to people. Sometimes I see things that might happen. Why didn't you tell us before? William asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the turmoil he felt inside. I thought everyone could do it, George admitted. I thought it was normal. But then I started noticing that other people seemed surprised when I said things. And Charlotte told me once that I was being weird. So I tried to stop talking about it. But today, with that guard, I couldn't stop myself. He was hurting so much, Papa. Inside his head it was like everything was dark and heavy. He thinks about those soldiers who died every single day. He blames himself even though it wasn't his fault. And he's been thinking about ending everything. That's why I asked him if he wanted to die. Because I could feel that he was considering it. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, she whispered. William felt a chill run down his spine. If what George was saying was true, the boy had just potentially prevented a suicide. But how is any of this possible? George, when you see these things, can you control it? Can you turn it off? William asked. George shook his head. Not really. It just happens. Especially when I'm near someone who's feeling something very strongly. Happy things, sad things, angry things. It's like their feelings are so loud that I can hear them even though they're not talking. William stood up and walked to the window, his mind racing. As a future king, he had been prepared for many challenges. He had been trained in diplomacy, history, constitutional law, and public service. But nothing in his education had prepared him for this conversation. "We need to get him evaluated," Catherine said quietly, standing and joining her husband at the window. "Psychologically, medically. We need to understand what's happening, and what if it's real?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if our son actually has some kind of ability? Then we still need to understand it. For his sake, can you imagine living like this? Constantly bombarded by other people's thoughts and feelings. No wonder he seemed more withdrawn lately." William nodded slowly. "We'll need to be very careful about who we bring in. This cannot get out to the press. Can you imagine the circus if word got out that the future king's son might be psychic? We need someone we can trust completely. A professional who can evaluate him properly, but who will also understand the sensitivity of the situation." As William and Catherine quietly discussed their next moves, George remained on the sofa, exhausted from the emotional toll of the morning. He didn't understand why he was different. He didn't want to be different. He just wanted to be a normal boy who could go to school, play with his friends, and not carry the weight of other people's pain. Back in his small flat in South London, James Morrison sat on his bed, still in his uniform trousers but having removed the heavy tunic. His phone buzzed with messages from concerned colleagues, but he ignored them. His mind kept replaying the encounter with Prince George. The boy's words echoed in his head. "You're not supposed to leave yet. You have important things to do still." James had been seeing Dr. Reynolds twice a month since returning from Afghanistan. They had worked through his survivor's guilt, his nightmares, his struggles with civilian life. He had made progress. But what George said was exactly right. Late at night, when the darkness felt overwhelming, James did sometimes think about ending it all. He had never admitted this to anyone, not even his therapist. He had a plan tucked away in the back of his mind, just in case things became too unbearable. But he had never acted on it. Something always held him back. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was the memory of his fallen comrades, and a feeling that ending his own life would dishonor their sacrifice. Maybe it was hope that tomorrow might be better. How had an 8-year-old child seen into the darkest corners of his soul? James pulled out his laptop and opened a search engine. He began typing "children who can read minds," and he deleted it. That sounded ridiculous. He tried again, "unexplained abilities in children." The results were a mix of paranormal websites, scientific skepticism, and psychological studies. Nothing concrete. His phone rang. It was Dr. Reynolds. "James, I just got a very unusual call from someone at Buckingham Palace. They want to schedule an emergency session, and they want permission to share your therapy records with their medical team." "What's going on?" James closed his eyes. "Something happened at work today. Something I can't really explain." "Does this have to do with Prince George?" They mentioned his name. "Yes, he said things he couldn't have known." "About Afghanistan?" "About my thoughts, Dr. Reynolds. It was like he was inside my head." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "James, I want you to listen to me carefully. What you're describing sounds like it was a very distressing experience. Sometimes in moments of high stress, our minds can play tricks on us. We can interpret coincidences as something more meaningful." "This wasn't a coincidence," James said firmly. He knew details. Specific details. The tower. The explosion. He described my nightmares. Another pause. "I think you should come in tomorrow. First thing, we need to talk about this properly. And I'll need to think carefully about what, if anything, I can ethically share with the palace." After hanging up, James sat in the growing darkness of his room. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere across the city, in a palace filled with history and protocol, a young prince was struggling with a gift he didn't understand. And somehow, their lives had intersected in a way that neither of them could have predicted. James thought about George's final words to him. "You have important things to do still. What could that possibly mean?" He was just a guard. A soldier doing his duty. What important things could lie ahead for someone like him? But for the first time in months, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity about the future. A small spark of purpose. Whatever had happened that morning, whatever impossible thing had occurred, it had shaken him out of the dark place he had been dwelling in. Maybe that was the important thing. Maybe staying alive, choosing to keep going, was itself the purpose. James didn't have answers, but he knew that tomorrow, when the sun rose again, he would still be here to see it. And perhaps that was enough for now. 3 days had passed since the incident, and Buckingham Palace was quietly managing a situation unlike any in its long history. A small team of carefully selected individuals had been assembled in absolute secrecy. Dr. Elizabeth Harrington, renowned child psychologist from Oxford with top-level security clearance, had been brought in. Professor David Coomer, a neuroscientist specializing in unusual brain activity, arrived from Cambridge. And Dr. Reynolds, James's therapist, had been granted special permission to participate in the investigation. The team met in a secure conference room in the private quarters of the palace. William and Catherine sat at the head of the table, their faces showing the strain of the past 72 hours. They had barely slept, spending their nights researching, worrying, and watching their son for any signs of distress. "Before we begin," William said, his voice steady but tired, "I need to make something absolutely clear. Everything discussed in this room is protected by the Official Secrets Act. What we're dealing with here has implications not just for my family, but potentially for the monarchy itself. We need answers, but we also need discretion." Dr. Harrington spoke first. "I've spent the last 2 days with George. I've conducted standard psychological evaluations, cognitive tests, and extensive interviews. What I can tell you is that he is a remarkably well-adjusted, intelligent, and emotionally mature child. He shows no signs of delusion, no markers for schizophrenia or psychotic disorders, no indication of fabrication or attention-seeking behavior. So what are you saying?" Catherine asked, leaning forward. "I'm saying that George genuinely believes he experiences these perceptions. Whether they're real or not is beyond my expertise to determine. But he's not making it up, and he's not mentally ill in any conventional sense." Professor Kumar opened a folder containing brain scans. "We ran a series of fMRI scans on George with your permission. The results are fascinating. When we asked him to describe what he calls his seeing, we observed unusual activity in several areas of the brain, specifically heightened activation in the temporal parietal junction, which is associated with theory of mind and empathy, and unexpected patterns in the anterior cingulate cortex. But here's what's truly remarkable." He pulled out another image. "We also observed what appears to be enhanced connectivity between regions that don't typically communicate this intensely in children his age, or in most adults for that matter." William rubbed his temples. "In plain English, Professor, what does that mean?" "It means George's brain is wired differently. He appears to have an extraordinary level of empathic and perceptive capability. Whether this extends to actual telepathy or precognition, I cannot scientifically confirm. But his brain is processing social and emotional information in ways we rarely see." Dr. Reynolds cleared her throat. "May I share something? I've been James Morrison's therapist for 2 years. The details that Prince George mentioned, the specifics about the tower, the explosion, the nightmares, these are things James has never discussed with anyone except me. Our sessions are completely confidential. There are no written notes that could have been accessed. I keep everything on an encrypted system and follow strict protocols. The only way George could have known these details is if James told him directly, which James insists never happened. Or if something else is occurring here. What about the possibility that George overheard something? Perhaps someone discussing Sergeant Morrison's background?" Catherine suggested, though her tone indicated she knew this was unlikely. Colonel Fitzwilliam, who had been sitting quietly, shook his head. "We've done a thorough investigation. Morrison's classified service record has been accessed only twice in the past year. Both times by authorized personnel conducting routine security reviews. Neither review included the specific mission details. No conversations about Morrison's mental health have occurred anywhere. In the palace where Prince George could have overheard them, We've checked security footage, staff schedules, everything. There's no conventional explanation. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The implications were staggering. If George truly possessed some form of extrasensory perception, what did that mean for his future? For the monarchy? For the country? We need to consider the practical aspects, William said finally. If George does have this ability, he needs to learn to control it. He can't live his entire life bombarded by other people's emotions and thoughts. It would be unbearable. Dr. Harrington nodded. I agree. I'd like to work with him regularly. There are techniques used in therapy for highly empathic individuals. Mindfulness practices, shielding methods. Even if we don't fully understand the mechanism of what he's experiencing, we can teach him coping strategies. And what about security implications? William asked, looking at Colonel Fitzwilliam. If he can perceive things about people, things they're hiding, could he be in danger? Could others try to exploit this ability? That's precisely why this needs to remain absolutely secret, Fitzwilliam responded. If word got out, Prince George would become a target. Foreign intelligence services, criminals, even just desperate people seeking answers about their futures. The boy would never have a moment's peace. We need to protect him not just physically, but also from becoming a spectacle. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I just want him to have a childhood, a normal life. How can he have that if he's different in this way? Professor Kumar spoke gently. Your Highness, many exceptional individuals have led fulfilling lives despite, or perhaps because of, their unusual abilities. The key is support, understanding, and guidance. George is lucky to have parents who believe him and are seeking help rather than dismissing his experiences. While the adults deliberated his future, George was in another part of the palace, sitting in the schoolroom with his tutor. He was supposed to be working on mathematics, but his mind kept wandering. He could feel the weight of adult concern pressing down on him from somewhere in the building. Their worry felt like a heavy blanket he couldn't shake off. Charlotte was at her own desk nearby, practicing her writing. She looked up at her brother with concern. Despite her young age, she knew something serious was happening. George had been different these past few days, quieter and more withdrawn. Are you in trouble? Charlotte whispered when their tutor stepped out of the room. George shook his head. I don't think so. I think they're trying to figure out what's wrong with me. Nothing's wrong with you, Charlotte said firmly. You're my brother, and you're perfect. George managed a small smile. I'm not perfect, Lottie. I'm weird. I scare people. You didn't mean to scare that guard. You were trying to help him? I know, but that doesn't make it better. What if I hurt someone by accident? What if I see something terrible and I can't stop it? Charlotte climbed down from her chair and went to George, giving him a hug. Then we'll figure it out together. That's what families do. Their moment was interrupted by the return of their tutor, and the children went back to their lessons. But George felt a small measure of comfort from his sister's words. Whatever was happening to him, at least he wasn't facing it alone. That evening, James Morrison received an unexpected phone call. It was from William himself, speaking privately and informally. Sergeant Morrison, this is William. I wanted to speak with you directly about what happened with George. I imagine this has been a difficult few days for you. James, who had been sitting in his flat trying to distract himself with television, sat up straight. Yes, sir. It's been confusing, to say the least. I want you to know that George meant no harm. He's a sensitive child who seems to perceive things in ways we don't fully understand yet. What he said to you came from a place of genuine concern. I understand that, sir. And if I'm being honest, as frightening as it was in the moment, his words may have helped me. They've given me a lot to think about. There was a pause on the other end. May I ask you something personal, Sergeant? Were you really considering suicide? James took a deep breath. I have thought about it, sir. I won't lie. After Afghanistan, after losing my friends, some days are harder than others, but I've never made concrete plans. I've never taken steps toward it. I'm in therapy. I'm trying to heal. Your son somehow saw that darkness in me and confronted it. It scared me, but it also made me realize how much I don't want to give up. I'm glad to hear that. Very glad. We've arranged for you to have access to additional resources if you need them. The palace takes the welfare of its staff very seriously, especially those who have served their country as you have. But I'm also calling because I wanted to ask if you would be willing to meet with George again. Under controlled circumstances, with his doctors present and his mother and me there, we think it might help both of you to talk about what happened. James hadn't expected this. Meet with him again? Only if you're comfortable. No pressure. But Dr. Harrington believes it might provide some closure for George. He's been worried about you, asking if you're all right. And honestly, we're trying to understand his abilities better. You're the first person outside the family that this has happened with so directly. I'll do it, James found himself saying. If it helps him, I'm willing. Thank you, Sergeant. We'll arrange something for tomorrow afternoon. And Morrison, one more thing. What happened between you and George? It stays between us and the few people who already know. Your career will not suffer because of this incident. In fact, Colonel Fitzwilliam has nothing but praise for how you've handled an impossible situation. After the call ended, James sat in his flat, processing everything. Tomorrow, he would face the young prince again. He felt nervous, but also curious. What would George say this time? Would he see more things? And more importantly, could James help the boy understand that this strange gift he possessed didn't have to be a burden? The next afternoon, a car collected James from his flat and brought him to a private entrance of the palace. He was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple shirt. Feeling oddly vulnerable without his uniform, Dr. Harrington met him at the door and led him through quiet corridors to a comfortable sitting room. How are you feeling about this? She asked as they walked. Nervous, James admitted. I've faced enemy combatants with less anxiety than I'm feeling right now about talking to an 8-year-old. Dr. Harrington smiled. George is nervous too. But I think this is important for both of you. Just be honest with him. Children can sense insincerity very quickly, and George especially so. The sitting room was warm and informal, with comfortable sofas and afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. William and Catherine were there, along with George, who stood up immediately when James entered. The boy looked small and vulnerable, so different from the composed figure who had confronted him days earlier. Hello, George said quietly. Hello, Your Highness, James replied, not sure whether to bow or offer a hand or simply stand there awkwardly. You don't have to call me that right now, George said. This isn't formal. Mummy said we're just talking. James nodded and sat down when Catherine gestured to a chair. George sat across from him, his parents on either side providing quiet support. I wanted to say I'm sorry for scaring you, George began, his words clearly rehearsed but sincere. I didn't mean to upset you. I just saw that you were hurting, and I wanted to help. You did help, James said, surprising himself with the honesty of his words. What you said to me, it was frightening, because it was true. I have been struggling. I have thought about giving up, but hearing you say those things, somehow it made me realize that I don't actually want to die. I want to live. I want to figure out how to be happy again. So thank you. George's eyes filled with tears. Really? You're not angry with me? No, I'm not angry. Confused? Yes, but not angry. Can I ask you something? George said hesitantly. Of course, the soldiers who died, the ones in Afghanistan. What were their names? James felt his throat tighten. Thomas Bradley, Michael Chen, David Roberts. Why do you want to know? Because they want you to know something. They want you to know they don't blame you. They know you did everything you could. And they want you to live your life fully, not spend it feeling guilty about surviving. The room went completely silent. James felt tears streaming down his face, unable to stop them. Catherine had her hand over her mouth. William stared at his son with a mixture of awe and concern. How could you possibly know that? James whispered. George shrugged, looking tired. I don't know how I know things. I just do. Sometimes it feels like people who aren't here anymore leave messages behind. Like echoes, and I can hear them. Dr. Harrington was taking notes furiously. This was beyond anything they had discussed. George wasn't just reading current thoughts and emotions. He was claiming to sense something from deceased individuals. James wiped his eyes. Thank you for telling me that. You have no idea how much I needed to hear it." The conversation continued for another hour. James talked about Afghanistan, about his guilt, about his journey in therapy. George listened with an attention span remarkable for his age, occasionally asking questions that showed deep understanding. By the end, both felt lighter, as if a burden had been shared and somehow lessened. 2 months had passed since that extraordinary afternoon in the palace sitting room. Life had settled into a new rhythm for everyone involved. The incident had been successfully kept from the public. Recorded in official documents only as a minor medical episode involving palace staff, the few people who knew the truth had signed binding confidentiality agreements and understood the gravity of the secret they carried. George had been meeting with Dr. Harrington 3 times a week. The sessions focused on teaching him to create what she called mental boundaries, ways to filter the overwhelming flood of emotions and thoughts he picked up from people around him. It was slow progress, but George was learning. He discovered that he could sometimes choose when to open himself to these perceptions and when to close them off. Though strong emotions from others still broke through his defenses. The young prince had also started keeping a private journal, recording his experiences at Dr. Harrington's suggestion. Some entries were simple, noting that he had sensed his father's stress about an upcoming speech or his mother's happiness during a family dinner. Other entries were more profound, describing vivid impressions that came to him about people he encountered or places he visited. One entry, written 3 weeks after meeting with James, read, "Today I felt something strange at school. My teacher, Mr. Roberts, was thinking about his daughter. She's sick, very sick. I could see her in a hospital bed. I wanted to tell him I knew, that I was sorry, but Dr. Harrington says I need to be careful. Not everyone wants to know that someone can see their private pain. I drew a picture for Mr. Roberts instead, of sunshine and flowers. I hope it made him feel a little better." William and Catherine had made their peace with their son's abilities, though worry remained a constant companion. They watched George carefully for signs of distress, made sure he had plenty of normal childhood activities, and fiercely protected his privacy. They had also made the difficult decision not to tell the extended royal family about George's gift. The fewer people who knew, the safer he would be. Charlotte had been told a simplified version of the truth, that George was very good at understanding how people felt, and that this was special but also tiring for him. She had accepted this with the easy adaptability of childhood and had become even more protective of her older brother, James. Morrison had returned to duty after a 2-week leave. He continued his therapy with Dr. Reynolds, but something fundamental had shifted in him. The guilt that had weighed him down for years felt lighter. He couldn't explain why George's words had affected him so deeply. Whether there was truly some message from his fallen comrades, or whether his own mind had simply needed permission to forgive himself. Either way, he was healing. Colonel Fitzwilliam had quietly reassigned James to a position that kept him at the palace but away from the ceremonial duties at the gates. The official reason was that they wanted to utilize his combat experience for security planning. The real reason was that Fitzwilliam had taken a personal interest in James's well-being and wanted to keep him close, where resources were available if needed. Unexpectedly, James and George had formed an unlikely friendship. Once a month, with permission from William and Catherine, they would meet in the palace gardens for an informal chat. These meetings were supervised from a distance, but gave both of them something valuable. For George, James represented someone who understood his difference, would experience the impossible, and accepted it without trying to explain it away. For James, George represented hope, a reminder that even in darkness, unexpected connections could bring light. On a crisp November morning, James was working in his new office when he received an urgent call from William's private secretary. There had been an incident during a school outing. George was safe, but something had happened that required immediate attention. James dropped everything and rushed to the palace. He found George in Catherine's private sitting room, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm temperature. The boy's face was pale, his eyes red from crying. Catherine sat beside him, one arm around his shoulders. William paced near the window, his expression troubled. Dr. Harrington was there as well, speaking quietly with palace security. "What happened?" James asked, kneeling down in front of George. George looked at him with haunted eyes. There was a man at the museum. We were on a school trip. He wasn't supposed to be there. I mean, he had a ticket and everything, but he shouldn't have been there. What do you mean? James asked gently. He was planning something bad. Not for today, but soon. I saw it in his head. He was thinking about the palace, about hurting people, about making a statement. I saw blueprints, maps, timelines. It was all there, James. Everything. William stopped pacing. George told his security detail immediately. The man was detained for questioning. He had nothing illegal on him at the time, but when they searched his flat, they found exactly what George described. Detailed plans for an attack on the palace, explosives, materials, manifestos. James felt his blood run cold. He stopped a terrorist attack. He may have saved dozens of lives, Catherine said quietly. But James, he's terrified. He doesn't understand why he had to see those things. Why his mind had to be filled with that violence. George looked at James with desperate eyes. Why do I have to see the bad things? Why can't I just see nice things, happy things? I don't want to know when people are planning to hurt others. I don't want to carry their darkness. James sat down next to George, and without thinking about protocol or propriety, pulled the boy into a hug. I know it's hard. I know it feels unfair. But George, what you have, this ability, it's a gift even when it doesn't feel like one. You saved people today. You stopped something terrible from happening. That matters. But I'm scared, George whispered. What if next time I don't see it in time? What if I miss something and people get hurt because I wasn't paying attention? That's not your responsibility, James said firmly, pulling back to look George in the eye. You're 8 years old. You're not supposed to carry the weight of the world. Yes, you have this ability, and yes, sometimes it shows you difficult things. But you have people around you who can help. You told your security team. They did their jobs. You did yours just by speaking up. Dr. Harrington came over and sat down with them. George, we're going to work through this. What you experienced today was traumatic. Seeing those violent plans, even secondhand, is difficult for anyone, especially a child. We'll process it together. And we're going to work harder on those mental shields, on giving you more control over what you perceive. Over the following weeks, the incident at the museum became a turning point. The palace security team, after much debate and soul-searching, developed a quiet protocol. George would not be used as a security tool. That was non-negotiable. He was a child, not an asset. But if he did perceive something threatening, there would be clear, immediate channels for reporting it, without placing the burden of decision-making on him. The man who had been planning the attack was charged and convicted. The case never mentioned how authorities had been tipped off, attributed instead to routine intelligence work. George's role remained classified as winter settled over London and Christmas approached. George was gradually learning to live with his abilities. Some days were harder than others. He would come home from school exhausted from filtering out the emotional noise of hundreds of children and teachers. But he was also discovering positive aspects of his gift. He could tell when Charlotte was feeling left out or sad before she said anything, and could include her in activities or give her extra attention. He could sense when his father was stressed about royal duties and would leave little encouraging notes in unexpected places. He could feel his mother's deep love for her family radiating from her constantly, a warm presence that comforted him. James continued to heal. He had started a support group for veterans at the palace, using his new position to help other former soldiers who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. He found purpose in this work, a way to honor his fallen friends by helping the living. On Christmas Eve, the palace held a small private service in the chapel. As was tradition, staff members who were working over the holidays were invited to attend. James was there, standing in the back row, when he felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down to see George standing beside him. The boy should have been with his family in the front pews, but had somehow snuck away. "Thank you," George whispered. "For what?" James whispered back, "For understanding. For being my friend. For showing me that difficult things can make us stronger instead of breaking us." James squeezed the boy's hand gently. "Thank you for saving my life. for reminding me that I matter." They stood together for the rest of the service, an unlikely pair, bound by an experience that defied explanation. A royal prince and a soldier, connected by a moment of impossible understanding that had changed both of their lives. After the service, as guests mingled over mulled wine and mince pies, William approached James. "Walk with me," he asked quietly. They stepped out into the palace gardens, their breath visible in the cold air. Security maintained a discreet distance. "I wanted to thank you," William said, "for being there for George, for accepting what happened without trying to rationalize it away or exploit it. You've been a steady presence during an unstable time. He's a remarkable boy, sir. You and the princess have raised someone special. We're doing our best. But I worry about his future. How does someone with his abilities navigate life, relationships, eventually the throne? How do you rule a country when you can sense everyone's hidden thoughts and motives?" "Maybe that's exactly what makes him suited for it," James suggested carefully. "A leader who truly understands the people he serves, who can sense suffering and respond to it, who knows when someone is lying or when they're genuine. That could be powerful." William considered this. Or it could be overwhelming. The weight of knowing everyone's pain. We show him that he can use his gift without being consumed by it. We remind him that he's still just George, not defined entirely by what he can do. They walked in silence for a few moments. Then William stopped and turned to James. "I'm going to ask something of you, and please feel free to say no. But I would like you to continue being part of George's life. Not as staff, but as a friend. Someone outside the family who understands him. Someone who can offer a different perspective as he grows up." James felt honored and overwhelmed. "Sir, I would be proud to do that." "Good, because I think you need each other. George needs someone who accepts the impossible. And I think you need someone who reminds you that life can surprise us in beautiful ways, even after darkness." Inside the palace, George stood at a window watching his father and James in the garden. Charlotte came up beside him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I'm thinking that maybe being different isn't so bad," George said slowly. "Maybe it's okay that I see things others don't. Maybe it's even good, as long as I have people who love me anyway." "I'll always love you," Charlotte said matter-of-factly. "You're my brother, even if you're weird." George laughed, the first genuine laugh he had managed in weeks. "Thanks, Lottie," as the winter evening deepened and lights twinkled throughout the palace. The various people whose lives had intersected that remarkable morning in October settled into their new realities. Dr. Harrington continued her pioneering work with an extraordinary patient. Professor Kumar published a carefully anonymized paper on unusual brain connectivity that would influence his field for years to come. Dr. Reynolds added new chapters to her understanding of trauma and recovery. Colonel Fitzwilliam implemented new protocols for supporting staff mental health, inspired by James's journey. Catherine and William learned to parent a child who defied all the parenting books. Charlotte became the fiercely protective sister of someone special. And James discovered that survival wasn't the same as living, but that with help and hope, one could transform into the other. Years later, when George was older and had learned to master his abilities, he would look back on that November morning as the day his life truly began. Not because of the dramatic confrontation with the guard, not because of stopping the terrorist attack, but because it was the day he learned he didn't have to face his differences alone. The connection between a royal prince and a guard who had frozen in shock would endure. Through George's teenage years, through his university days, through James's eventual marriage and family, through triumphs and setbacks, they maintained their unlikely friendship. They spoke rarely of that first encounter, but both carried it with them always. What had seemed like a breaking point had actually been a turning point. George's words, "Do you want to die?" had been shocking, inappropriate, and impossible. They had also been exactly what James needed to hear at exactly the right moment. And in saving James, George had begun the journey of understanding his own path. The palace kept it secret. The press never learned about the young prince's extraordinary abilities. Life continued with its rituals and routines, its public appearances and private moments. But beneath the surface, Something remarkable had occurred. A connection had been made that transcended normal understanding, proving that sometimes the most impossible things are also the most real. As winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer, the gardens of Buckingham Palace bloomed with new life. And in those gardens, on occasional quiet afternoons, you might have seen a growing boy and a healing soldier walking together, talking about everything and nothing. Proof that grace can arrive in the most unexpected forms, and that saving someone often means being willing to be saved yourself. The story of what really happened that day remained locked away in classified files and trusted hearts, but its effects rippled outward in ways both seen and unseen, touching lives and changing futures. Sometimes a single moment of impossible understanding can alter the course of many lives. Sometimes a question meant in compassion, however shocking, can pull someone back from the edge. And sometimes, just sometimes, the line between the extraordinary and the everyday proves to be thinner than anyone imagined.